topic tonight is the Chilcot Report has exposed Blair for the Iraq invasion of 2003. How culpable is former Prime Minister John Howard for this ongoing disaster? And our speaker tonight is Alison Broinowski, who is a former diplomat. She has a PhD from ANU in Asian Studies. She has written or edited 12 books about Australia and Asia, and is currently the Vice President for Australia's for War Powers Reform. There are some leaflets at the front if you want to read about that. Okay, Alison, please.
Thank you, everybody. It's really nice to be back in the pub, in the politics, and seeing some of the familiar faces and some new ones as well. A few things have happened since I was here last. One of the things that has happened since I talked to you last is that finally, after years and years and years, Sir John Chilcot produced his report. It took 7 years from go to woe, and a lot of people thought that, predicted that it would be a whitewash, like 3 or 4 other reports that had been done in Britain on aspects of the Iraq War. And as it happened, I was in London on June the 6th, on the day that it came out. There we were, I and my little granddaughter, outside the Houses of Parliament, and it was amazing. There is a big hall called the Queen Elizabeth Centre, and inside there was Sir John Chilcot launching his report. And outside were thousands of people. There was a great big queue of people waiting to get into the Houses of Parliament, as usual. There was another great crowd of people doing a demo about Chilcot with figures dressed up as judges and figures with Tony Blair masks on and banners waving and all kinds of activity going on and lots of noise. And then in the middle of all this, just as the moment arrived for the proceedings inside the hall to take place, whoever it was decided to have a carillon recital on top of Westminster Abbey. And the noise was absolutely diabolical. So there are bells over here, there's demo over here, and there's this speech going on inside. It was impossible. And so I'm hanging around outside, and I'm sitting next to this man, and he's plugged in, and I said, "Are you listening to that?" And he said, "Shh." And you know who it was? Philippe Sands, the great great British academic who's written on Chilcot in the London Review of Books and everywhere else. It was just so mind-blowing. And then, of course, after that, we saw Tony Blair on television looking as if he had been beaten with sticks. He was in some, remote location, like a hotel room with sort of yellow wallpaper behind. And he was trying to say, in some sort of convincing manner, that he didn't know anything about all the things that Chilcot said he did know about, and that it wasn't his fault, and that it was the intelligence agencies that misinformed him, and he was completely right to have done what he did, and he still defended what he did, and it was just that he was given misleading information. Where have we heard that before? Right. And John Howard and George Bush and Tony Blair have all been scripted with the same line. George Bush doesn't say much, but every time John Howard is asked, and he is on, by the way, tonight on Tom Switzer's program, so you won't be able to hear it unless you've got your radio at 7:30, he will say the same thing again and again and again. Just the same lines. Now, what Chilcot, to everyone's surprise, proved was quite comprehensively that was, to put it politely, bullshit. from start to finish. So, not that it was a huge surprise to anyone to learn this, because we all knew it, but what was the surprise was to have Chilcot say it, and say it in such a measured, careful, well-documented way, without, he said from the start, this is not legal, this is not a court, these are not legal proceedings. What I have been asked to do is to find the facts. And 12 volumes of facts are what he found. Enormous amounts of material, but very well organized and very carefully presented. The subject being, how did the UK, not other countries, how did the UK plan to invade Iraq in 2003? How did it then invade Iraq? And what did it do after that? Up to, and remember this, up to 2009. That was the end of the period of the inquiry. This becomes important. I'll tell you why in a minute. So there it was, released on the 6th of July this year. So what did Chilcot find? In very brief summary of all 12 volumes, and even the executive summary takes ages and ages to read. Very small evidence that Saddam Hussein in 2002 or 3 had any weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical or biological. No surprise to any of us, but it was a surprise, as I say, to have this confirmed by an official source. There was no yellow cake imported from Niger, none. There were no mobile factories for producing chemical and biological weapons. And remember Alexander Downer? Anyone who believes that he doesn't have them is a fool. Remember Alexander? I wish Alexander had come down from Australia House to Westminster on the 6th of July and been there to listen to this. Fool. Another point that Chilcot, in Chilcot's conclusions, that the policy of invading Iraq had been in place since very early in 2002. Not exactly sure when, but probably before March. And it was cooked up between Blair and Bush. The two of them together worked it out and kept it secret for more than a year, while denying that it was there. In July 2002, Blair wrote to Bush and said, "We will be with you, whatever." So that meant that the policy was in place. He was going to take Britain to war without any clear understanding of what that was for, except that he would be, or Britain would be, with the United States, whatever. Whatever that means they wanted to do, whatever the reason was, and whatever the outcome might be. From that time on, said Sir John Dearlove, the head of MI6, the intelligence, you remember this famous expression, was fixed around the policy. The policy existed first, the intelligence was massaged to fit around it like a sausage roll. Chilcot says alternatives to that invasion, and there were many, were progressively set aside, and much too soon. In other words, they could have waited for a resolution of the Security Council, which they didn't get. They could have waited for the final reports of the weapons inspectors in Iraq. They didn't. They were desperate to go ahead. It was a climatic thing, partly. They didn't want to go in there in the midsummer, but also because they had the troops raring to go. Everything was on hold, and Bush was getting impatient. He wanted action. Furthermore, says Chilcot, there were legal reservations, serious ones, from his own legal advisors, from the Lord Chancellor, who would not would not, for months, agree that the invasion of Iraq was legally justifiable. Because remember, in international law, if you're going to invade a country, you've got to have one of three things happening. One, the government itself needs to have invited you, if it needs you. There has to be a resolution of the Security Council calling on member states to use all available means, all necessary means, to invade a country. Or three, your own country has to be at immediate threat of invasion or attack itself. So in other words, self-defense. None of those three conditions was present. And so the Lord Chancellor couldn't possibly agree to it. And at the last moment, he was leaned on and forced to change his opinion and to give an opinion to the government that sort of said it's legal, which it wasn't. So, what are the consequences in the UK? What came out of that day? Immediately, people called, and don't forget, it happened just at the same time as Brexit. They were losing ministers left, right and centre, and the Prime Minister himself resigned. And the leaders of two other parties resigned, and their replacements resigned, and there was just chaos in London. But immediately there was discussion of possible action against Blair. Now that is finding its way slowly forward. It may be an action against him in the Parliament, or it may be in a court. And we will see where that goes, because as I said, Chilcot was not a legal inquiry. He left any criminal proceedings to legal authorities. So the equivalent of our DPP would have to examine the evidence that's been produced and decide whether there is a case to be made against Tony Blair and or others. So I don't think some of them are sleeping too well at the moment. But one of the other consequences for the UK, which is interesting, is that there's now an established convention as a result of the disaster that Iraq was. There's now an established convention in the UK Parliament that there should be a debate and a majority vote in the Commons before troops are deployed. Now, Blair, to his credit, actually did do that in 2003, but he conned the members on both sides of the House to such an extent that they actually believed the stuff that he'd been feeding them for over a year about Saddam Hussein and what a monster he was and how the world had to be rid of him, and how if they didn't, he'd give his weapons of mass destruction to Al-Qaeda. He didn't have any. But that was what Blair was doing. He was softening up the Parliament, which Bush didn't need to do, because he already had the authorization for 9/11 to do whatever he liked in the war on terror, and the war on terror was infinitely extendable to wherever he wanted it to go. But Blair had an obligation, which he honoured, or a convention, as you have in the United Kingdom, because they have no constitution, to have a matter of such importance debated by the Commons and voted upon. They did. Ever since then, any further wars that the UK has gone to, with a couple of exceptions, have been the subject of a debate and a vote. In 2013, Cameron went to the Commons and said he wanted to bomb Saudi Arabia, bomb Syria. And they said, yeah, he gives them the bombs. And the Commons voted it down, which put a real, the frighteners on Cameron. And he didn't make that mistake again. They went into Libya, don't forget, the Brits, with the United Kingdom, with the United States, on the pretext that it was just to enforce a no-fly zone over Benghazi. And then they stayed and did a whole lot more things. That was strictly illegal, but he didn't take it to the Commons, and the Commons reacted against this. That's why he did get a debate in 2013. But since then, which is really interesting, there has been mission creep in the UK and in Australia too. In 2014, the Brits went back into Iraq, and in 2015, they started bombing Syria without a debate or a vote. So what he's doing is, in fact, extending the very pattern that took place and was reported on in Chilcot into the present era. I'll come back to how that's important for us in a moment. The point is this: if Chilcot had not taken so long to produce his 12 volumes, if he had produced them in 2011, which is when they were originally promised, then the events that I've just described in Libya and Iraq again and Syria probably would not have taken place. Because today, if somebody wanted to do a war of that sort in the UK, there would be hell to pay, because they've got Chilcot now, which shows how they were lied to and how badly it was done. And so you see, if Chilcot had come out sooner, that would have had the kind of reaction that we're seeing now, and the Prime Minister of the day would have been scared of the action to be taken against him for illegal aggression. So it's a pity that Chilcot took as long as he did. Okay, now that's Britain. What about Australia? At least the Brits had not one but 4 inquiries into various aspects of the Iraq War. What has Australia done? Australia had 2 limited inquiries, one in December 2003 in the Parliament, led a cross-party committee of inquiry led by David Jull, which looked at the intelligence agencies and the intelligence that they had provided to the government on which the invasion of Iraq had taken place. The results of that didn't please John Howard, because in fact he said that both the DIO, the Defence Intelligence Organisation as it was then called, and ONA, the Office of National Assessments, the 2 main intelligence bodies in Canberra, both of them had reported to the government before the invasion, had reported to the government that there was a reduced or zero threat of weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein. He had them in 1991, there's no doubt. How do we know this? Because the Americans kept the receipts. They knew what he had because they gave them to him. They were to attack Iran with. And then they got worried afterwards because he kept them. And they then decided, as they often do, that their enemy had changed, largely when Israel suggests that it's time. And so what they were worried about was that the very things they knew he had, he might have developed into something that, as they said, could be handed to Al-Qaeda and could be used by terrorists. The fact was, though, that between 1991, after the first Gulf War, and 2002, the sanctions that have been posed under the UN on Saddam Hussein had such an effect that he had, in fact, slowly had neither the money nor the capacity to keep this stuff going, and he had let it decline, or made it decline, to such a point that there was nothing that he could have used in any way to hurt anybody seriously at all. However, Saddam Hussein, being the kind of monstrous tyrant that many saw evidence of, he didn't admit this publicly, because that would have been to give the Iranians, his major concern, a free kick, thinking, we can attack Iraq now, as we wanted to before. We lost the last time, we'll have another go at Iraq. And of course what Saddam Hussein wanted was to keep them scared that they might get anthrax, or they might be done with mustard gas, or they might even have a nuke dropped on them. And so as long as he could keep Iraq scared, he did that by lying and lying and lying, and keeping on getting sanctions imposed on him by the UN, and more inspectors coming to have a look for his stuff. And he gave them a hard time, and then his enemies in the West said, well, you see, the fact that he's being so cagey with the inspectors means that he's got something to hide. This proves the point. And one of my former colleagues, Richard Butler, even believed that at one point, I think, and misled everyone. However, the fact was, and Saddam Hussein's son actually said it and produced a great big document showing what they had and what they didn't have, and said the stocks of what we used to have are now depleted to the point of not being usable. And of course, the people who were bent on war wouldn't believe him. Partly their fault, because they were consummate liars, but Chilcot said they should have been given the benefit of the doubt, at least to go further to prove that that was true or not true, rather than the dire consequences that came from invading Iraq. So this was the Chilcot Report in Australia. Now, John Howard didn't like that, because what ONA and DIO were saying was exactly that they could not find, and they put it very carefully, they could not find evidence that what Saddam Hussein had in 1991, he still had in any way that was of any consequence. So Howard commissioned another report from the trustworthy Philip Flood, who used to be head of Foreign Affairs, and who could be relied upon to produce a report that made things look a little bit better for the government. And what Flood obligingly did was, he said that ministers, that's to say Howard and Downer mainly, had not been given intelligence that showed them that Saddam Hussein conclusively didn't have weapons of mass destruction. So in other words, there's sort of a negative and a negative aimed to prove that ministers had been misled. In fact, the intelligence agencies hadn't misled them at all. They told them the truth, and what the ministers decided to do was ignore the inconvenient truth and listen to the intel that they were getting from the US and the UK, which had been satisfactorily massaged in the way I just described to make the point. And so what they were saying was, well, what Flood said, therefore, was that the intelligence, the Australian intelligence given to ministers, was a failure. It was thin, ambiguous, and incomplete. Well, it was only thin, ambiguous, and incomplete if, in fact, the WMD existed and the will to use them and pass them to terrorists, etc., were all in place. But in fact, proving that they were not there was the reverse of thinness, ambiguity, and incompleteness. It was to say that a policy based on this stuff is extremely dangerous and misled. So that killed it in the media in Australia. After Flood, there were no more sort of hassles raised about the legality or appropriateness of the war, because by then the khaki election had kicked in, as Howard knew it would. He had won it. His supporters said that justified what he'd done, that the people had spoken, and that therefore the democratic process had approved the invasion of Iraq. which of course, as many of you will remember, we all marched against before it happened in February 2003. But those very same agencies that I just mentioned had clearly advised Howard that there was no compelling case for war. He knew that. They had told him that, just as the same agencies, the counterpart agencies in Britain, had told Blair. And both prime ministers chose to ignore it. When did Howard make that decision? Hard to say. In a way, you have to go back to 2001 when he was in the United States, as you remember, on 9/11, and it went to his brain to such an extent that on the way back to Australia, he unilaterally extended the mandate of the ANZUS Treaty to oblige Australia, as he put it, to go to war with the United States anywhere in the world, rather than in the Pacific area, which is what the treaty covers. And so, in a way, you can say that his then participation in Afghanistan followed from that, and then Iraq in 2003 followed from that too, if you want to use that kind of justification. As I said earlier, it was illegal in international law. Just the fact that he claimed that our treaty justified that action is a stretch, a legal stretch, much too far. But, and this is where he differed from Blair, the legal advice that Howard got was, talk about thin and incomplete, the legal advice he got was so dodgy that you would not believe. The appropriate thing for a government in Australia going to war, and we know that the Prime Minister can do it on his own, but nonetheless, the Prime Minister ought, on a matter of that seriousness, to seek the opinion and the advice of the Solicitor General as to the legality of the action. And the Solicitor General should get independent legal advice and then present it to the Prime Minister before that is done. That was not done. Instead, what Howard got was an opinion from a senior officer in the Attorney General's Department and a senior officer dealing with legal affairs in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and both of them gave the rubberiest legal grounds that have been described in scathing terms by professional lawyers for the invasion that they proposed to make. So, when did he decide to do it? If you read Howard's own biography called Lazarus Rising, which came out in, a couple of years ago, I think, 2 or 3, 2014, I think, he actually describes going to the Bush ranch at Crawford and sitting down with Bush and discussing the prospects for war in Iraq. So that was June 2002. That was a month or two after Tony Blair had done the same thing. We don't have a record of what Tony Blair and Bush said to each other. And we don't have a record, apart from what Howard says in Lazarus Rising, of what passed between him and Bush either. He says they were very careful not to refer to specifics of a particular war and that they didn't know when it might take place. Oh, yeah. All right, so that is one of the things that we don't know. This is now my list of things we don't know. What actually passed between Howard and Blair and Bush, and when did it pass? Because for over a year, all three of them denied that there were any plans for war. And Howard said so several times in the Parliament. He lied to the Parliament because they had plans for war. You don't take the troops to war without a plan, and it takes months and months and months to get them up to speed and pre-position the troops and have it all ready to go. They lied. As I said earlier, nothing is known of what took place after 2009 because that's when Chilcot stopped taking evidence. So if we knew what else has happened since then, we'd also know how they've planned the subsequent adventures in Libya and back in Iraq and now in Syria, because there's a whole nother Chilcot waiting there to give us the facts on how they did that. Another thing we don't know is why, and this is a puzzle for me, why in the world Australia needed to leave the others to one side. They can deal with their own problems. But why in the world Australia felt so threatened by Saddam Hussein that we needed to invade Iraq? No other country in our region, not any of our neighbours, was interested in that. None of them thought that they were going to be attacked by Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. So what in the world did Australia have to do with it? The question is left dangling. Here's another thing we don't know, if something had happened, whatever, to change their minds, and Bush and Blair had decided not to invade Iraq, would Australia have done it? Or would the threat suddenly have disappeared? Oh, it's okay. Saddam Hussein's safe now. No worries. We don't have to attack him. What was it all for? No explanation, no answer. Another final thing we don't know, there are plenty more, but it just occurs to me to ask these things. What part of the ANZUS Treaty, if that's the answer to the previous question, we did it because of our alliance with the United States, which is what most people would say, what part of the ANZUS Treaty obliged Australia to do it? The ANZUS Treaty, if you read it carefully, says that each of us, the United States and Australia, will consult together in the event of a threat to either of them in the Pacific region. And then even after having consulted, they will decide what to do according to their constitutional processes. In other words, they would have to go back to their own legislature and ask if this is a good idea. In the United States, they would certainly have to go to Congress and get approval for such a war. So where was the obligation in the ANZUS Treaty that made us go into Iraq? Well, the only one is the one I mentioned, that is Howard's unilateral extension of it to cover everything that moved since 2001, which is a very strange way to amend a treaty or to read the Constitution on the run. Talk about captain's picks. Not bad going. But the absence of debate in this country on these issues is absolutely staggering when you think of the issues that are involved and the seriousness of them, and how we have inquiries into any damn thing, any moment of the day, into one boy mistreated in a Northern Territory jail. We have a royal commission. Why don't we have a royal commission into Iraq, where thousands, millions of people have died, and we have spent millions and millions of dollars for what? Furthermore, other results of the war. We're still fighting the same one as in 2001. Call it terror, call it whatever you like. Change the name, change the enemy, move on. This is endless war for endless peace, as Donald Rumsfeld so pithily put it. So you see, here we are, and because we haven't had a Chilcot in Australia, we are still there with government not telling us why, not telling us who asked us, not telling us where the legal justification for it is, or even what the outcome is supposed to be about. How would we know what a success in Iraq or Syria, which are civil wars for God's sake, what a success would look like. One of the other results of the war, of course, is that Islamic terrorism has taken off throughout the Middle East. It was there before, but it's absolutely taken off throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa. And with the refugee outflow that you see from those countries into Europe, which in its turn has put NATO under strain, the European Union under pressure, and has resulted in Brexit. See that? See the sequence of events. When first you practice to deceive, be careful of what you weave. You see? And one step from 2001 has brought all of this tumbling down around us, including now acts of terrorism in Australia, which we deserve because Muslims feel they have an obligation to defend their co-religionists in countries where they're being attacked, and if not there, then to attack their attackers wherever they are. And that is what we're seeing on behalf of misguided individuals, no doubt, but individuals who believe that this is behaviour on Australia's part that needs for which they ought to extract revenge. And that is what we're seeing. And that's why that trooper got attacked with a knife in Britain when he was just walking back to his barracks and killed. And that's why the London train bombing took place. And the man who did it was heard to say, "This is for Syria." See the point? This is blowback. This is unintended consequences of war. If you attack a Muslim country, wait for the blowback. And we don't even think about it because our reasons for going into Iraq were totally unclear and untransparent. And the ordinary Australian taxpayer has no idea what they were, yet we pay for it. And, worst of all, the perpetrators of this, Bush, Blair and Howard, who really ought to be indicted for war crimes, have not been, and I'll be surprised if they are, although there are calls for it. The United States, naturally, doesn't acknowledge the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, so it won't happen to them. And George Bush will die in his bed. What will happen to Howard and Blair? Well, let's see if there's any difference. What then should happen? Okay, briefly. Australia should catch up with all the other countries involved and have a proper inquiry into not only the invasion of Iraq, but the three wars, Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, and how we went there, why we went there, what we did when we got there, and why we are still there. This is imperative. It should include a cost-benefit analysis of what it cost us and what it produced, and was it worth it? Chilcot didn't do that. Its legal shortcomings should also be thoroughly exposed, if only because defying international law and breaking our own laws is a very dangerous precedent to set, because it can get out of hand, it can get worse, and it will get worse if governments are allowed to go on doing it. We should reform the war powers, which allow the captain's pick for war. We can do this not by changing the Constitution, but by changing the Defence Act, which has been used for the last 3 deployments to allow the Defence Minister of the day to simply send troops to wherever the National Security Committee of Cabinet decides they should go. We've got to get reform to that. And one of the other processes that needs to be put back in place is the role of the Governor-General, strangely enough, who is Commander-in-Chief and who ought to get advice from a Prime Minister who's about to send Australians to war, saying, this is why we're doing it, we want you to approve this. And if the Governor-General is not satisfied, he or she can ask for information that will be satisfactory. And that puts a bit of a spanner across a Prime Minister's works. The other thing that we believe should happen is there must be a debate and a vote, preferably in both houses of Parliament, before Australia goes to war. Now, many people say, well, what's the point of doing that? The majority will win anyway. And that may be the case. And if that's so, then it's the democratic process working. And if that's what the people's representatives want, well, fine. But they are then responsible for it to their electorates. And when it goes badly, as it will, always, they have to go back to their electorates for their next pre-selection or their next re-election and say, I voted for that, I shouldn't have. Or I voted for that, it's a disaster. And their electorates are thereby also energised and empowered in a way that we're not at the moment. We all sit there going, And individual parliamentarians then have to take responsibility for their actions and their decisions. And I think that is the appropriate way to use our system. And to prevent future Prime Ministers having a rush of blood to the head or hoping to win a khaki election and just sending off the troops at whatever cost, to do whatever, doesn't matter. All right, so these are things that should happen. So what is happening? What's happening is that Australians for War Powers Reform, that little brochure I sent around full of propaganda, is one of several groups in Australia that are getting very active on this. Another one is ICAN, the Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. Another is IPAN, the Peace Network, largely active in Brisbane. But groups like this are really gaining influence, and we're beginning to see some results even in the Parliament. We've got the Greens and the Independents, a large number of them supporting this sort of thing, and Scott Ludlam has just put a lot of amazing questions on notice, which will come up in the Parliament, asking for details of the various things that I said a little while ago we didn't know, asking government to produce those facts and show us, for instance, where is the invitation for us to go into Iraq and put troops on the ground again? There is none. And Julie Bishop has lied, saying there is one. There isn't. And so Ludlam is asking for information like that. So we're getting more movement from the opposition, particularly as the narrowness of the gap between the opposition and the government gets finer and finer. The opposition at last is starting to see some potential in having something resembling independent foreign and defence policy. And the other thing that's happening, which we notice all the time on our websites, is that we're getting huge amounts of really intelligent commentary, really good letters to the media, really good blog articles and so on by ordinary Australians who've just made it their business to understand this stuff. And anyone who says, we're a dumb lot, we deserve what we get, they're really quite wrong, because the degree of interest and understanding of these issues is quite reassuring. It really is encouraging, and that's why we keep on doing it. And we begin to think that after about, I suppose we've been on this for about 4 or 5 years now, we're beginning to make some sort of headway. So any of you who want to join us, there's your little brochure, and I hope that some of this has been of interest to you.